The African Bushmen, descendants of the first Homo sapiens, tell tales of a world very different from the one we know today. Long ago, people and animals lived together peacefully, underground, with Kang, the Lord of all life. No one ever wanted for anything, and although there was no sun in the earth below, it was always light. As this harmonious underground utopia flourished, Kang planned the wonders he would put in the world above. First, Kang created an enormous tree with branches stretching across the entire sky. At the base of the tree, he dug a hole, which reached all the way down to where the people and animals lived. After he had finished creating the world above, he led the first man up the passageway. The man sat down on the edge, and soon after, the first woman came up to join them. When all of the people and animals had risen from underground, Kang gathered them at the base of the tree. He told them all to continue living peacefully together, but then he turned to the humans and warned them not to build any fires, or a great evil would descend upon all of them. They promised, and Kang left to a place where he could watch in secret. As the first day waned, the sun began to set. The people and animals watched this new event together, and when the sun disappeared, fear entered the hearts of humanity. They were blind, unlike the animals who could see in the dark. They were cold, unlike the animals with their fur and feathers. Shivering and terrified of the first night, a man suggested that they build a fire for warmth. And forgetting Kang's warning, the people did so. However, the flames frightened the animals. They fled into the darkness, and ever since people defied Kang by building fire, they have lost the ability to communicate with animals. The Bushmen of Africa believes that what we see of ourselves is only the outside form or body, but inside is a living spirit that we cannot see. Fear had replaced the friendship within, once held between us all, darkening our souls forever. I'm Brett Edwards, and I welcome you to join me as we explore the mysterious history of the first sin. This is Dark Souls: A New Mythology. When prompted to explain sin, most people in the Western world would recall the biblical story of Eve. It's one that most of you are probably already familiar with, at least in passing. When God left Adam and Eve on their own in the Garden of Eden, much like Kang did when he warned people not to build fire, God instructed the first humans in his new world not to eat the fruit which grew on the tree of the knowledge between good and evil. For if they did, they would bring death upon themselves. For a time, this was a simple order to follow. Adam and Eve lived in harmony with all of the animals, and none wanted for anything. But one day, when Eve was alone, she was approached by a serpent. The serpent spoke, convincing her that eating the forbidden fruit would not kill Adam or her, but instead would grant them the same knowledge as God, something they lacked. Desiring the wisdom which the serpent spoke of, Eve was tempted and ate the forbidden fruit, which she then shared with Adam. Thus, fear was introduced to humanity with the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve felt shame at the sight of their nakedness and fashioned clothing to cover themselves. And when God later returned to Eden, they tried to hide, knowing that they had disobeyed his only request. When God saw what they had done, he cursed the serpent for its temptation, and then banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden forever, leaving behind a paradise of eternal life for a world of suffering and death. This story embodies the concept known as original sin, or more broadly, ancestral sin. The idea that the transgressions of our forefathers have led to the punishment of their descendants. In the previous episode of this series, I questioned the nature of the first flame, including how and why it came into existence in the Dark Souls universe. After examining similar creation stories in Western mythology and literature, I theorized that either the first flame was introduced by an outside source or entity, or that the first flame itself exhibited a power or will of its own. I believe the answer to which of these interpretations is most correct lies with how we interpret the lore of the first sin in Dark Souls. But before we look further into what little we are told about the first sin provided to us across the Dark Souls trilogy, I feel it is important to examine what we know about the first flame's connections to the creation of life and the bestowment of souls. It was accepted in the last episode that the appearance of the first flame caused the creation of all life in the Dark Souls universe, including the life given to the archtrees and dragons of the Age of Ancients. Once again, I'll quote the opening cinematic of Dark Souls to support this. In the Age of Ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog, a land of gray crags, archtrees, and everlasting dragons. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity, heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. Then from the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame. They who came from the dark to claim the souls within the fire were new beings created by the first flame. We know this because they did not exist prior to the flame's appearance, and the cinematic clearly states that with the fire came both life and dark, and from the dark that life came to claim its souls. What is a soul in Dark Souls, though? The soul items available in each game give us hints in their descriptions, which help explain the answer to this. Whether you are playing Dark Souls or Dark Souls 2, all regular soul item descriptions state that the soul is the source of all life. Dark Souls 3 introduces the idea of transposition, and other beings are able to fashion and manipulate souls throughout the series, such as the souls possessed by the experimental creations of Seath the Scaleless and Aldia. However, given that the ultimate source of all life is derived from the existence of souls, and the first flame is known to have both created life and bestowed souls. It must be concluded that the first flame is the source of all souls in the Dark Souls universe. Therefore, to possess a soul in the Dark Souls universe is to possess a piece of the first flame itself. With that established, we can now examine and theorize what exactly the first sin was in this universe. We know two basic things about the first flame, which are inherently linked to each other. One, that the very existence of the flame is that of a congregation of souls. And two, that souls can be taken from and be returned to the flame. This universal law might explain why the flame eventually began to fade, as more and more souls were drawn from it over time. Was the first sin the splitting of the flame, as shown in the Dark Souls opening cinematic? I don't think so, granted that the flame appeared to freely give its souls to those who claimed them. And if we consider that the flame may have a will of its own, then it could have purposely created each of the lords. Alternatively, the lords could have been souls within the flame from the beginning, much like Phanes in the Cosmic Egg, who exerted their will by possessing the bodies of the first beings who approached. Even in this scenario, I don't recognize any action which would be considered an ancestral sin by definition. The simple action of obtaining form had no apparent repercussions on the lords or their descendants. Could the first sin instead have been the later attempt by the Witch of Izalith to create her own flame? This archetype stems not only from the folklore of African Bushmen, but also from stories like that of Prometheus in Greek mythology, Lucifer in some doctrines of Gnosticism, and numerous other figures in ancient religious beliefs. As you can see, playing with fire is a common thread when discussing the concept of original sin. But, given what we know from the life's work of Aldia, I don't think that the creation of the Chaos Flame was the first sin either. At least, not canonically to the Dark Souls universe. If we are to believe the words spoken by Aldia himself in Dark Souls 2, then the first sin occurred at the time of the original linking of the fire. If the creation of the Chaos Flame was the first sin, then it would have taken place prior to that event. And although the conclusion can absolutely be made that the Witch of Izalith's actions fit the criteria for ancestral sin, given the horrible punishment it dealt to her descendants and followers. According to more than one source in Dark Souls lore, it is not considered such. This is a strange and mysterious contradiction, considering what we know about the nature of sin. A very popular theory among Dark Souls lore enthusiasts is that the first sin was committed by Gwyn, which is supported by the following in-game dialogue from Aldia, scholar of the first sin. Once the Lord of Light banished dark and all that stemmed from humanity, and men assumed a fleeting form. These are the roots of our world. Men are props on the stage of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie. This theory is further supported by dialogue from one of the primordial serpents who appears in the first Dark Souls, Darkstalker Koth. After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the 3 souls. But your progenitor found a 4th, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside. And soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark. Clinging to his Age of Fire and in dire fear of humans and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them, Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature. By sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans, Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord. Resisting the course of nature and imposing his personal will upon universal law to prolong the Age of Fire definitely fits the criteria for original sin. Not only do Gwyn's own descendants suffer due to his action, living the remainder of their days chained to the ramifications of his decision, but linking the fire cast a terrible curse upon all of humanity. The ancestors of the Dark Soul, who were seemingly destined to inherit the world after the first flame had faded away, were instead forced into servitude to the flame and to shoulder the harshest repercussions of Gwyn's actions. An endless cycle for the Age of Fire, cursed to link the flame over and over again, shackled by an unnatural new world order created by a desperate god. Sheep to be shepherded to assure the never-ending reign of the lords. Prisoners in an enormous jail of lies. This is how Koth and Aldea interpreted the linking of the fire and humanity's struggle to regain the free will and lordship which was stolen from them. It was their belief that Gwyn committed the first sin and that it was humanity's task to break the shackles of fate caused by that original sin. After more repetitions of this unnatural cycle have occurred than can be counted, we can see in Dark Souls 3 the continuing influence of this belief system in the Sable Church of Londor. It's unknown whether Koth is still alive in the world of Dark Souls 3, but the Sable Church clearly worship and follow his doctrine, enacting it on a scale previously unseen in the series. The opening cinematic of Dark Souls 3 even shows the Pilgrims of Londor, signifying them as an important aspect to the story you are about to unfold. The story of how humanity finally broke free from the first sin's punishing curse and claimed the true power of the Dark Soul. Yes, you heard that correctly. Dark Souls 3 is, to me, the end of the Age of Fire, which we saw begin with the appearance of the first flame. The initial focus on and ever-present reminders of the Sable Church's pilgrims throughout the game, the Lords of Cinder themselves refusing to link the fire any longer, and the attention to detail in the extensive questline which unlocks the Dark Lord ending. It's due to all of these that I believe Dark Souls 3 not only intentionally implies we are experiencing the final cycle of the Age of Fire, but that the developers at FromSoftware want us, the players, to finally usher in the Age of Dark to end the series. Is the Dark Lord ending truly how humanity exerts its free will and breaks the shackles of fate, though? Despite all of the developers' efforts to push you toward not linking the fire and believing in the Dark Lord's rightful claim to destiny, something which had been teased since the first Dark Souls by including alternate endings which might lead toward that future. Dark Souls 3, unlike the previous 2 games in the series, has a third possible ending. Instead of following the beliefs passed down by Koth and stealing the souls within the First Flame for mankind alone, or continuing to be shepherded by the past lords who linked the fire, Dark Souls 3 introduces a choice which is purely the player's decision. You can entrust the First Flame to the final Firekeeper and let it go out. A true Age of Dark, in the literal sense. What does this have to do with the first sin, you might be wondering? That is what this episode is supposed to be about, after all. Well, I can finally get to that now, because I believe that Gwyn may not have committed the first sin, or at least not alone. I believe this because of the third ending's existence in Dark Souls 3, in addition to the fact that the creation of the Chaos Flame, though it occurred prior to the linking of the fire, was not considered the first sin. Across all 3 games of the trilogy, there is a little understood but hugely influential party at play, beyond both the machinations of Gwyn and the temptations of Koth. One so dangerous that the inheritors of the Lord Souls were nearly killed by it, and whose resolute will rivaled that of the First Flame itself. Let me tell you the story of how and when I believe the first sin was committed in Dark Souls. When the First Flame appeared, disparity was introduced to the timeless symmetry of the Age of Ancients. Out of the flame came the First Lords, mighty souls imbued with the will of the fire, the power to create a new world. The Witch of Izalith, Lord of Life, Nito, the Lord of Death, and Gwyn, the Lord of Light. But the fourth Lord Soul, the quintessence of dark, was different. Rather than being bequeathed the will of the fire, the Dark Soul was given free will. While the other lords brought forth cataclysmic destruction, building their new world from the ashes of the ancient, the inheritor of the Dark Soul instead decided to birth a child, Manus. Manus birthed numerous children of his own, and so it went on, as the Dark Soul was split into countless smaller pieces, creating humanity. When the other lords had nearly finished establishing their new age, they found themselves already surrounded by the growing civilizations of mankind, having completely forgotten about the Dark Soul during their quest for fire. And as they then gazed upon the incredible ability of humanity's free will to reshape the world they had created, they felt fear for the first time. For in free will, they only saw the strength to resist the flame. But none feared the power of the Dark Soul more than Gwyn, the Lord of Light. Rather than allow mankind total freedom, the 3 lords conspired to rule as gods, to keep the threat of free will in check. They built Lordran, a great city atop the First Flame, and commanded humanity to live under their tutelage. They eventually went as far as to coerce most of the Dark Soul's oldest children to to live in a place called the Ring City, a high-security prison established under the guise of safety and protection. It was at that moment, when fear had taken the hearts of the other three lords, and they had decided to govern humanity's free will through deception, that Velka, inheritor of the Dark Soul and mother of humanity, became the goddess of sin. The first sin had been committed by her fellow lords against her own children, and so she resolved to forever punish the souls of those who would sin against others. Velka is a mysterious and rarely mentioned figure in the lore of Dark Souls, but there is enough factual information available to know that she was not only considered an outsider by Lord Round's self-enthroned pantheon of gods, but even incited full-scale rebellion against them. It's important to note that my theory about the true first sin and of Velka's origins presented here is simply that, a theory. It likely differs from your own, and that's okay. The wonderful thing about exploring subjects as vague as Velka's storyline in Dark Souls is that interpretations can be wildly different, but concurrently plausible. There just isn't enough evidence to state otherwise in many cases. However, despite how little we know, I'd like to explore the story of Velka further, because as I said, I believe it's directly linked to the hidden third ending of Dark Souls 3 and the noble journey of humanity to right the wrongs done by the Lords of the First Flame. Next time on Dark Souls: A New Mythology, we'll explore the mythological archetypes which could have inspired the lore of Velka, the goddess of sin, the painted worlds where her followers were banished, but instead made a home for themselves, the true nature of humanity, and how these things all tie into the end of the Dark Souls universe as we know it. Until then, I'll leave you with this, a quote from the humanity item description in the original Dark Souls. If the soul is the source of all life, then what distinguishes the humanity we hold within ourselves? Thank you for watching this episode of Dark Souls: A New Mythology. This series is written and produced by me, Brett Edwards. Some of you may be familiar with my band, Soulmass, where we've adapted the lore of Dark Souls to the sounds of punishing death metal and somber doom metal. The Soulmass YouTube channel hosts this video series, so if you're interested in hearing more, you can check out some of our uploaded music here on the same channel. Music for Dark Souls: A New Mythology was composed by Patches the Soundbringer. If you'd like to listen to or purchase his music for this series, you can find a link to his Bandcamp page in the video description. Original artwork for the series was created by Samuel Nelson. You can find a link to his art page in the video description as well, where he sells original work and takes commissions if you're interested in art for an album cover, book cover, or illustrations. Narration was recorded at SciaticAudio by Aaron Sluss and engineered by Brett Windnagle at Hypometric Studio. The Dark Souls opening cinematics featured in this video were recorded by Devinguy. He streams video games on Twitch, including lore-centric Soulsborne playthroughs, so check out his channel, linked in the video description, if you are interested in watching him play the games and hearing his take on Souls lore. Demon Souls, the Dark Souls series, and Bloodborne are properties of FromSoftware, Namco Bandai, and Sony Interactive Entertainment. All of the videos, songs, images, and graphics used in this video belong to their respective owners, and I or this channel do not claim any right over them. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Until we meet again, my fellow undead, don't you dare go hollow.